Welcome to my session, Why is the Enterprise Access Model Important? Today, we are hosted at Cloudeight, which is sponsored by ScriptRunner and the 365 blog, where we thanks that they are sponsors today. In my session today, we are talking about how we can protect our identity infrastructure. First of all, there are a lot of criminals outside and they start really small attacks. But what we try to prohibit during or with the enterprise access model is limiting the lateral movement and especially also the domain dominance, which they try to get. Just as a short example, last year, I know from multiple customers which had a serious breach, and they started all with a small email where somebody clicked on a link, and at some point the attacker were able to have the full domain dominance. That means they had domain admin credentials, they had even access to Unix, Linux, Mac OS systems within the environment, and were able to execute everything and really destroy a lot of data within the network. And that's the case which we never want to have in our company, because it means a lot of work. And to protect us from this, the enterprise access model is really important. I would like to show you how it protects and also give you a few basic information regarding how you can implement it in your environment. First of all, a little bit about me. I'm Thomas Kurt. I'm a workplace consultant and CEO at BaseVision. I am working every day with all the Microsoft technologies which are available on the market. I have done the Certified Ethical Hacker certification, and I'm also a Microsoft MVP. During my free time, I am contributing to the community via the Workplace Ninja blog and also via the events we organize there. If you have any questions during this session, don't hesitate to just interrupt via raising your hands in the Teams meeting. And if I don't see the raise hands, then just unmute yourself and ask the question directly. So, first of all, I will give you a short introduction why we are doing it. Then we are going through the core components of the enterprise access model, and then we will also discuss the roadmap options. So why are we having normally a zero trust conversation? That's the basic foundation which we have to talk about. Zero trust, a lot of people are talking about it, and it has a lot of things defined, but why do we have this zero trust conversation at all is previously we had simple IT security. We were focused on the network because we were thinking that the network was our security boundary, but that has changed a lot in the past. And this means that attackers have shifted to identity threats and are attacking us via phishing and password cracking and all other stuff via the cloud, via our devices, which are no longer within the secure network boundary. So that's why we need to protect our identities with new methods. And here Microsoft has changed a lot with the enterprise access model. The core principles of zero trust are that we have to verify explicitly what is going on in our network, that we are using all available data to decide if somebody is trusted or not just an IP address, for example. We're also talking about least privileged access just talking about a normal IT department, there often the support team has nearly full access to most parts of the IT infrastructure. The engineering team anyway is nearly everywhere administrator, probably also domain admin. And for their normal work, they probably do not even require that one. Then the third part of Zero Trust is that we always thinking about, okay, we are already hacked. Now, why have I started with Zero Trust? Because if your company is going into the direction of Zero Trust, the enterprise access model will support you by especially these things. Through the enterprise access model, we will implement just-in-time and just-enough access models. We will add risk-based adaptive policies to the infrastructure. We will work on the segmentation of the network users, especially the users, so the identities, but also devices are identities, for example, in the on-prem network. So segmenting this one is important. And then also it supports using the analytics, because there are also components within the enterprise access model which are here to monitor and trying to figure out if there is something malicious happening in the environment. So enterprise access model helps us to fulfill the goals of Zero Trust. But what other goals exist within the enterprise access model? One goal is that we secure our Azure AD and AD environment. That means especially that we limit privilege escalation options for attackers, so that it's not so simple to get administrator privileges. The other thing is also that we try to protect the password hashes, because they can help in a rainbow attack, for example, an attacker to gain more access or laterally move within the network. Also, a goal is that we limit the access paths to just a few authorized pathways. We come back to that a little bit later when we are talking about privileged access workstations. Then monitoring what administrators are doing. That's something which is often missed and is really important. I mean, if an administrator creates a new administrator, was that really approved? Was that a desired action, or was there already some attackers which are trying to create a second option to access the environment? And the fourth point is that we also try to reduce the amount of permissions users have. Most often in an environment which is running over a few years, the users are normally overprivileged. They change departments and always get just new privileges, but don't lose the old one. Other benefits are that administrators, for example, will get specific administrative devices where all the admin tools are installed. If I just remember back in all my at all my jobs, when I got my notebook to work, first installing RSAT tools, installing the config manager console, installing that and this, and that's a lot of work. And each and every administrator has to do that on their own. And with an enterprise access model, then you have predefined work devices for these admins, which simplifies their life. Another benefit is related to the least access privilege, but I would mention specifically is that it reduces the amount of users which really require domain and global admin rights, because we are talking through the implementation really about when are they really required and when not. Another goal is important is definitely that we don't want to block administrators from work. They still should be able to do their work, but some tasks may be a little bit more complicated because they cannot just do it from their normal work device, for example. But others could also be more simple. So now, what is the enterprise access model? If you are aware about all the identity models which Microsoft already has in past, that was especially the Active Directory tiering, also red forests and LAPS were parts which they told us to implement, that were not really traditional approaches because they were just focused on the on-prem network. And Microsoft has realized there are so many other attacks which are possible now via the cloud. For example, Azure AD, a guest can see all the memberships, all the groups in Azure AD by default. We have now applications which are trusted or applications which are nearly identities or have access to data. So the whole app registration service principle part. We even have new infrastructures. We have an infrastructure in Azure. We have an infrastructure probably in other clouds like Amazon. And that are all new risks which should be considered. So Microsoft has taken this all together and built the enterprise access model. The bad thing is a little bit that the new enterprise access model is more or less a description about what could be done really on a high level. It mentions issues and challenges and how you can face them, but it's not a clear technical manual how to implement. For example, for Active Directory tiering, there were manuals available, GPOs and all the things which clearly says, hey, you have to do that, that, and that, and then this will work. The enterprise access model is really written down only on a concept level. And that's somehow a problem because also allows some interpretation for everyone. So how does this model look like? First of all, we have still different planes available. That's like the tier model which we had before. But now a little bit extended. Oh, sorry. We have first the access path. That's the privileged access, which defines how we can access these different levels. That means we have specific accounts, we have specific devices which can directly or via intermediaries access management systems. Then we have the different levels. We have the control plane. That's like the tier 0 in Active Directory. We still see here the Active Directory and the Azure AD are part of that one. So the control plane is nearly everything which is able to authorize people. So which is giving us credentials, meaning that couldn't be certificates or OAuth tokens or whatever. Then we have the management plane, and something which is important here. Before we had just the tier 1, which are servers, for example, are tier 1. Now Microsoft divided here also the infrastructure away. Because, for example, if we say, okay, our Hyper-V servers are tier 1 and our Azure is tier 1, but what is if I run a domain controller on this Hyper-V server or in this Azure infrastructure? Then probably a tier 1 admin has access via hard disks, for example, when the machines are powered off to the domain controller. So we have also to think about the whole stack. And that's what is important here. So the management plane is now divided into the infrastructure. And then it gives you also the possibility to define multiple workload planes, which means you could, for example, say all my SAP systems are together, and you could also define there a security boundary. I, in my opinion, or in my projects, normally have one workload plane because it's an additional complexity to have these restrictions applied to. Because if I have to use multiple administrator accounts, even one for my SAP environment and another one for my for managing the file servers, for example, that could be a huge problem. So there you have also to talk about, okay, what is then really possible for my environment? But separating the infrastructure from the workload plane is definitely not a bad idea. Then what was also added and is, I think, a good addition is that it really covers also the application access. That means especially the service principal OAuth applications. We have also to consider that they can be malicious. Just in the past few days, there were new announcements made by Microsoft that they see that hacked tenants were used to create malicious app registrations, which then are used during phishing campaigns to gain access to other tenants. That are all possibilities. So we have really to take care about application access and also external users. So the whole guest access needs also to be maintained. So you see, it's a difference to the previous model, but we still have the same principle. We would like to bring or add some barriers for attackers to gain more rights than they already have. So that if an attacker, for example, is accessing in tier 2 or has access to the user workload plane, he's not able to get access to a higher plane in the hierarchy. And that's the most important part, which really has not changed. But because we have now the cloud, we have also to consider other protection mechanisms. So first I said protecting the pathways to privileged access. If you're just thinking about how we access or how normally customers access their management interfaces, they have their normal workstation where they are logged on with their normal account and probably logging then on with an admin account to an admin web portal or doing an RTP connection, for example, to a server. We miss there that during an RTP connection, the password hashes and the login credentials of the admin are also used on the local machine. So the admin is also logging on in the background on this machine. And if an attacker is on the user device, he's able to get these credentials. Or he can even interact with the interface if we have it open, for example, via keystroke injection or whatever. So it's important that we build up different access paths and that we clearly block the elevation to it. So that's the end-to-end approach which we have to reach, that we can clearly say, okay, that's a privileged user. It can only be used on these specific devices to protect the credentials of them. So how do we design normally the enterprise access model? If we just taking the model from Microsoft with all the information they provide on docs, it's hard to define what settings we really need to define. So we created a key component list. We see one big component which is important is the privileged access workstation topic. Then the second thing is the AD tiering on premise, which is nearly the traditional approach. the Azure AD tiering, separating the cloud from the on-prem administrative world, using conditional access to have the risk-based approach built in. And then we have also some things which help, but are probably not required to get the protection mechanism. One is identity protection, which can definitely help. Also, Defender for Identity can help, especially, or what is a really cool feature in Defender for Identity is to see the lateral movement paths. So if you have Defender for Identity deployed, you can simply get a list of users and how they could gain domain admin rights. And if you do that in an environment, you most often see that it's extremely simple to get domain admin privileges because, for example, a supporter with admin privileges is logging on to a standard device during a support case. The attacker is on this specific device and grabs the credentials of the admin. Then he's able to do a lateral movement to other workstations, and he will try to get access to a workstation, for example, which is used by a server engineer. Probably the server engineer will install from time to time some custom software on his device because he's anyway domain admin, logging on his system with domain admin credentials and installing the software, and the attacker has already domain admin credentials, for example. A Defender Identity can really show all these paths in a simple way, so you don't have just to use Bloodhound, you can really also use the Microsoft tools for it. Then Azure AD Application Proxy is a simple way to publish internal web applications and protect them via conditional access. So we can then use all the conditional access stuff like MFA, using compliant device. So all the zero trust principle we can then apply also to traditional web applications, just by using app proxy instead of another reverse proxy infrastructure. Also helpful in the whole infrastructure is Intune, because Intune is able to create the compliance status on each device, which can contain, for example, is the virus scan active, is the firewall active, and many other checks. You can even create custom checks. And based on that, we can then use conditional access, for example, to block access if the device is unmanaged or if the device has a specific risk score or whatever. A related topic, but not required for the enterprise access model, is a network segmentation project. Because the enterprise access model is really working on dividing the identity infrastructure, blocking logon, that doesn't require also the network segmentation. But if you segment the network, you will definitely reduce the attack surface, and that's always good, as at least separate the domain controllers from all other components in the network. So that's the overview about the key components. We will now do a deep dive to all core modules and start with the privileged access workstation. Here, I got a lot of questions from customers. For example, can I just use, for example, a terminal server within my infrastructure, so my admins can access this terminal server and then do their admin work? I mean, a lot of companies have such jump hosts. Is that really a privileged access workstation? No. The problem is here that that we see the user is working on, I just have to add the laser pointer here. They are working then on their device, are logged on with their standard account, and then they are connecting to these intermediaries and have an open session to it. So if an attacker is here, he can also access this session. So it does not fulfill the clean source principle. We have there an elevation from a standard device. We can have a keylogger installed here. Then the attacker is able to get my credentials, for example, which I type in a RTP session or whatever. So is that really secure? No, definitely not. But we can use Azure Virtual Desktop or a Citrix as an intermediary. Yes, that's possible. But if you really would like to have privileged access workstation, then it needs to be a dedicated physical device. Is that something which a lot of customers are doing? That depends a little bit. Yes and no. The problem here is or would every admin or would an admin like to have always 2 hardware devices with him? So he has to have a bigger bag. He has to carry on this if he is on duty, for example. All this needs to be considered. And at the end, it's a risk decision. Are you taking the risk of this elevation or not? That's a decision up to you. What is also a possibility is if an admin is really doing more or less administration, then he could use a physical device as privileged access workstation and has a virtual machine running on it which he can use as a normal standard workstation. That's possible. But is then, for example, a team session running well? Probably not. So also there, I think if you would like to be on the secure side, then you need to have a dedicated physical machine. Otherwise, you have to talk about if you are accepting the risk of these elevation paths to an intermediary. Good. So that's more or less what also is important here is, or what is recommended, that you use strong authentication methods. So that you, for example, on the workstations block password authentication, that you use FIDO keys or enforce Windows Hello for Business, so that you also can protect from attacks which are collecting your password when you are typing it. So core point, window privileged access workstation. Now, if you're talking about Active Directory, here, that's still the same like before. We would like to prevent lateral movement between the clients. We would like to prevent pass-the-hash attacks, credential theft, and privilege escalation. That are all things which we try to protect. The key point here is that each of these tier or plane, or how we call it, has dedicated group policies assigned. For example, on Tier 2, we have a policy assigned which denies logon via network, via local logon to all accounts and computers which are here in a higher tier. So it's at the end, it's just a group policy which blocks logons on these tiers. That means a domain admin is no longer able to log on an end device. With that, we have protected the past ticket, past the hash attacks. We can protect us from that. Getting more information into how to build up an Active Directory tiering is not so simple today, because if you use Google to search for AD tiering, somehow the old blog articles are really downrated and cannot be found. Because of that, I have added here a URL at the bottom. It's a really nice blog from Daniel Metzger, which is now working for Microsoft, which has a good written block how to implement this tiering, and he's also give you hints about where there could be problems and issues. And a few of them I would just to cover now. One thing which you have to consider is always what is now a tier 1 system or a tier 0 system. I said at the beginning, tier 0 is everything what is able to authorize people. So Active Directory definitely is part of it. Azure AD Connect also. Azure AD Connect has the replication permission within the environment. So if somebody is on the Azure AD Connect server, he can replicate the whole domain database and is able to extract all the password hashes, for example. So that one also needs to be protected. Also, an important component within an infrastructure are certificate authorities, which definitely should be in tier 0, because they are able to hand out certificates to somebody, which can then be used to authenticate them. So if somebody is able to access the certificate authority, they can create certificates, for example, for a domain admin. Also part of tier 0 is, if you have it still in use, is for example ADFS. Then also important to know is that the separation here is normally not a big problem. So separating tier 0 from the rest of the infrastructure is more or less simple, because anyway, the users which are using these systems, which I just talked about, are more or less domain admins. So the most important point is here, creating new tier 0 users, assigning them domain admin rights, block access for them to all other systems, and remove the domain admin privilege from all other accounts. That's the most simplest thing. So separating and blocking an attacker from getting tier 0 access, and with that domain dominance within your environment, is not a big step. It's a little bit more than on tier 1, because you have probably to talk about all the service accounts which are used currently. Probably they are overprivileged and things like that. So this one can lead to some effort. And tier 2 is also most often not a big deal, because anyway, normally just normal users are logged on. So the only thing you have to consider here is that you have to provide new tier 2 admin accounts to all the support engineers, which need to have more permissions on their devices. So that's Active Directory tiering. Really great article from Daniel Metzger on the specific block. And now we are talking about Azure AD tiering. Here, the first and most important point is account separation. I have so many customers which started the Azure AD or Office 365 journey. They are synchronizing all their on-prem admin accounts to the cloud and are assigning also admin privileges to them in the cloud. What is here the big problem is, if your on-prem environment is hacked, also your cloud environment is hacked, because the attackers can log on using the credentials and can also do malicious things on Azure AD and all the sources which are attached to Azure AD. So the first step here is creating cloud-only accounts and just assigning them privileged access in the cloud. Remove global admin and all these privileges from on-prem accounts. So that's really, really important. The same applies to guest accounts. You should never have guest accounts which have administrative privileges assigned within your Azure AD, because if the other tenant is breached, they can use the guest account and have also permissions in your tenant. Then there are other things, delegated admin rights. That's really important. I hate this topic a little bit because we are on our own also Microsoft partner. Microsoft has in their partner system a method to measure the performance of partners. And one of them is by measuring what permissions a partner has within a customer environment. So that leads that partners are trying to get delegated admin rights in customer environments, which reduces security, which is providing the possibility for supply chain attacks. And they are doing that just for a partner status. And that's something which I think is really bad. And for that reason, I would also show you how you can check that. If you go to the Office 365 admin centers, go to settings and then partner relationships. It loads, then you see here what partners are allowed in your tenant. And you see here the role authorization. For example, in my Contoso test tenant, Base Vision has the delegated admin privileges. So everybody in Base Vision AG within this tenant with the respective roles assigned has full access, global admin rights within my test tenant. And that's a big security risk because if an attacker gets access to this tenant, he has also access to this tenant. And that's a problem. So always check that you are not accepting these authorization. You can even remove that. Here, remove roles. The problem is here that you have to talk definitely with your partner also. Sometimes they are using it because they are your managed service provider and are using that to manage your infrastructure. But there are other possibilities which can be granted via just-in-time permission. You can, for example, use access packages, so Azure AD entitlement management, for example, to grant them access, which is much more secure than these delegated admin privileges. Also, the GDAP, granular delegated admin privileges, is a little bit different. Here we have just global admin. Here we can also say, okay, partner X has just exchange admin permissions. So that's here the difference. But both of them, I think, are not good because they are permanent and most often they are used just because of the partner status and not because the partner really requires the permissions. Then another important point is emergency accounts, which should be considered. You should have at least 2 emergency accounts which don't have MFA applied, where you constantly monitor if they are used. They should never be used unless there is really an emergency. And then one thing is using Azure AD PIM to really also, if you have dedicated admin accounts, that they have just the permission they require, and this also just time-bound. Here, Azure AD PIM is really cool, works well. It doesn't work for guest accounts. For guest accounts, we normally use entitlement management, which is a feature where you can define an access package. An access package defines to which groups users can be added. You define which tenant or which group can request this access, and you have a link which you then can provide to the partner, and all employees of the partner, which are member of a specific group, can then go by themselves and request access, which are defined in the access package. So that's a really cool thing. Then the next thing is conditional access. I assume most of you know conditional access very well. Here, just a thing to add is the new feature that we can also protect workload identities, which was not possible until I think spring this year. You can also define now that the specific app registration or enterprise app can only be used from a specific endpoint. So if you create an app registration or a workload identity, that you can define, okay, this identity can only be used if its source is in an Azure data center, for example. So that also drastically can increase the security. Then another thing which started this year is also the topic around Mfa Fatigue. So that's when a user gets so many MFA prompts from an attacker that at one point he just clicks accept because he don't want to longer be disturbed, for example, during night. And here's something which was also released this year are the cross-tenant settings. If you have specific partners or customers with which you are working in your Office 365 environment, instead of requiring that they have to register for MFA in your environment, you could also set up a legal contract with the partner that they have to check or do an MFA or have to have compliant device or whatever. And then you can define that you trust the specific source tenant, for example, for the compliance state. With that, you no longer need to prompt for MFA, for example, because you have the legal contract with the source tenant that they have checked that virus scan is active, firewall is active, and whatever. And that's really a cool thing. For conditional access, if you have any questions, Daniel Kronlund has great blogs about how an attacker can go around conditional access. So conditional access is not just if it's enabled, it works very well, protects you from everything. So you have also to know what are things which attackers still can do. And he also provides